I used to think that money was a purely transactional thing, something you earned, spent, and hopefully saved. I never imagined it could become the wedge that separated me from my own family. My mother remarried when I was 20, just a year after my father passed away. Her new husband, Roger, seemed cordial enough at first. He had a warm laugh and a polite manner, always offering to help around the house and praising my mother's cooking. He even asked me about my part-time job at the local tech store, acting like he cared about my future and my interests. But as the months went by, the glossy veneer wore thin, and I started seeing the real him. He had an older son, Jacob, who was only a year younger than me. I tried to welcome my stepbrother into my life, but I quickly realized he was lazy and entitled. He hopped between community colleges, never completed a class, and complained that professors were too strict or that textbooks were too expensive. He had no job, no ambitions, and seemingly no concerns about mooching off his father or anyone else who offered. I was 19 when my father passed, and that loss forced me to grow up quickly. I started saving every dollar I could. Even as I worked part-time, I lived modestly, hoarding my savings in a high-yield account. My goal was to move out eventually, maybe buy a used car. Having something stashed away made me feel secure, like I still had some control over my life. My mother had been living off the small inheritance my father left, mostly to cover house bills and groceries. I never asked for a cent of it because I knew it was all she had until she could find a better-paying job. She worked at a flower shop, part-time, and the pay was barely enough to keep up with the mortgage. When Roger moved in, I hoped he would at least share in some of the financial burden. He claimed he had a steady job as a consultant for a marketing firm, but I rarely saw him leave the house at a consistent hour. Most days, he lounged in front of the TV, watched sports, and occasionally tinkered with some freelance gig on his laptop. He boasted about how good he was at talking clients into big deals, but I never saw any real evidence of it. Meanwhile, Jacob spent his days streaming video games, complaining about his life, and demanding that someone pay for his tuition when he enrolled in yet another new program. I tried to stay out of their business. My focus was on my own job and my own savings. I avoided fights, mostly because I didn't want to upset my mother. I knew she was still fragile after losing my dad, and if Roger gave her some companionship, I felt I had no right to disrupt that. But the first sign of trouble came when I noticed small discrepancies in my bank statements. It was subtle at first, just a few transfers here and there that I didn't remember making. At first, I told myself it had to be a banking error. I even went to the branch in person to ask if there was a mistake, but they confirmed the transfers were made online. I lived in denial a bit longer, hoping it was just an accounting slip on my part. But one evening, after I got home from work, I stepped into Roger's makeshift office in the corner of the living room and saw that he had my laptop open. He jumped when he saw me, slammed it shut, and stammered some excuse about checking the Wi-Fi settings. I felt a chill in my stomach. That night, I reset all my passwords and enabled every security measure I could find. I even called the bank to request a new card and told them to block any external transfers unless I personally verified them. Still, I had no proof Roger was behind anything, just a nagging suspicion that wouldn't go away. The next time I caught him snooping was in my bedroom. He said he was looking for a screwdriver, but my desk drawers were open, and I knew he had no business in there. That was when I realized I needed to be proactive. I installed a small camera in my room, aimed at my desk, purely for my peace of mind. Within days, I had footage of him rifling through my things. By then, I suspected he'd been stealing from me, but I still didn't have the nerve to confront him. When I finally did gather the courage to confront him, it wasn't because of the camera footage alone. It was because my bank account suddenly took a major hit. Someone had withdrawn nearly $5,000. That was a huge chunk of my savings, money I'd been setting aside for a down payment on a small condo I'd been eyeing. I remember the day I discovered it, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I immediately called the bank, demanded an investigation, and requested all possible details about the transaction. They told me it was transferred to an account under Roger's name. That was it. I had all the proof I needed. I confronted him in the kitchen, tears burning in my eyes, fury vibrating through me. My mother was washing dishes at the sink, and she dropped everything to see what the commotion was. He denied it at first, said I was confused, maybe it was a computer glitch. When I told him the bank had records of his account, he tried another angle, claiming it was a temporary loan he intended to pay back. I looked to my mother, expecting her to explode with the same outrage I felt, but instead, she stepped between us and spoke in a soft, trembling voice. She said Roger was only trying to help Jacob pay for his classes, that her stepson needed a chance at a decent future, and that I was still young enough to earn the money back eventually. I've never felt so betrayed in my entire life. My father's death had shaken me, but this was something else. My own mother, the woman who'd always told me to be self-reliant, was now telling me to just accept the theft of my savings because I was young and capable. I was furious. I demanded that Roger return the money immediately. He shrugged and said he'd already paid the tuition fees and it wasn't refundable. Jacob needed the classes, he insisted, and it was for the greater good of our blended family. My stomach churned as I realized they'd planned this behind my back. My mother must have known from the start. I told them both that if Roger didn't return my money, I would involve the police. That's when my mother started sobbing, telling me not to ruin everything. She begged me to think about the family's harmony. She claimed that if I got the authorities involved, Roger might lose his job and we'd all be in financial ruin. I found myself torn between my desire for justice and my fear of shattering whatever remained of my family. Eventually, I decided to give them a chance to make it right. I asked for a repayment plan, something that would ensure I got my money back without having to drag them into court. Roger agreed, but only half-heartedly. He said he would start paying me back in a few months once Jacob finished his semester and he got more clients. Those months came and went with no payments. Roger would make excuses every time I asked. He said Jacob needed more textbooks, or he was waiting on a big client check. I watched as Jacob continued to lounge around the house, skipping classes and complaining that college was pointless. My mother, meanwhile, looked at me with tired eyes and asked me to be patient. She reminded me that we were a family and needed to support each other. But the longer this dragged on, the more my resentment grew. I felt like an outsider in my own home. I couldn't understand how my mother could just brush off the fact that her husband stole from her child. Even if it was to fund Jacob's education, it didn't make it right. After half a year of empty promises, I decided I'd had enough. I told Roger and my mother that I was done waiting and that I wanted my money back immediately. I threatened to go to the police if he didn't start paying me back within a week. Roger laughed and said I was bluffing. He stood there in the living room, arms crossed, smirking at me like he owned the place. Jacob chimed in that I was being selfish, that I didn't care about his future. My mother just looked away, unable to meet my gaze. That hurt more than anything. I realized then that if I wanted justice, I'd have to take matters into my own hands, even if it meant burning bridges forever. The next day, I took a personal day off work and marched into the local police station. I wasn't sure what I'd say, but I knew I had to do something. I spoke with an officer, explained the situation, and showed him the bank records. He said it was a civil matter, but if I wanted to press charges for theft, I could try. He warned me it might create a permanent rift. I told him that rift was already there. I filed a report, but I knew that was just the beginning. The officer said they would investigate, contact Roger, and possibly bring him in for questioning. I walked out of the station feeling both terrified and strangely relieved. I had finally taken a step toward reclaiming my dignity. When I got home, I found Roger in my room again, rummaging through my drawers. I snapped. I screamed at him to get out, and I told him I'd gone to the police. His face went pale. He tried to intimidate me, stepping closer, towering over me, but I didn't back down. My mother came rushing in, and I told her point blank that I was pressing charges. She looked horrified, not at Roger, but at me. She started to cry, accusing me of tearing the family apart. I told her that Roger had done that the moment he stole from me. She pleaded with me to reconsider, but I'd reached my breaking point. Roger disappeared for a few days after that. I learned from a neighbor that the police had come by, asking questions. My mother was inconsolable, pacing the house and fretting about how this was all going to look. She was more worried about appearances than the betrayal itself. I tried to explain that I was pushed into this, that Roger had stolen from me and refused to pay me back. She said I was being vindictive, that I should have just let it go for the sake of peace. That's when I realized she'd chosen her side from the start, and it wasn't mine. A week later, I received a call from the investigating officer. He said Roger had agreed to a mediation process, willing to sign an agreement to repay me in monthly installments as long as I dropped the charges. I considered it. I didn't want to see Roger in jail necessarily, I just wanted my money back. I met with the officer, Roger, and a mediator. Roger tried to play the victim, claiming financial hardships and blaming me for putting undue pressure on him. I refused to budge. The mediator eventually got Roger to sign an agreement to repay the stolen amount within 1 year, with the first payment due immediately. If he missed any payment, I could reinstate the charges. I felt a small victory as I walked out, but a bigger part of me knew I could never trust my mother or Roger again. For a short time, Roger actually started making payments. They were small, but consistent, and I began to see a glimmer of hope that I might recover most of my money. However, as the months passed, the payments became more sporadic. Roger claimed he had health issues, then said he lost a client, then insisted Jacob needed more financial support. Each time, he fell further behind. I warned him repeatedly that if he didn't keep up, I'd call the mediator and reinstate the charges. He'd act contrite for a week or two, then fall back into his old patterns. Meanwhile, my mother's relationship with me deteriorated. She accused me of being heartless, of wanting to see Roger suffer. She said I was tearing the family apart over something that could be replaced. She refused to see that it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect, about betrayal, about boundaries that had been completely disregarded. Every day, I felt the tension in the house. Jacob would shoot me dirty looks and grumble under his breath whenever I entered the room. Roger avoided me altogether, and my mother barely spoke to me except to criticize or demand that I be more compassionate. It became unbearable. After another missed payment, I decided I was done waiting. I contacted the mediator, informed him of Roger's failure to comply, and requested that the charges be reinstated. This time, I wasn't interested in any more negotiations. I wanted real consequences. As the police began their renewed investigation, Roger panicked. He tried to beg me for more time, offered me partial payments in cash, and even tried to rope Jacob into a guilt-tripping scheme. Jacob came to me one night, claiming he was on the verge of a big breakthrough at school, that he'd repay me once he landed some imaginary high-paying job. I laughed in disbelief. He had barely passed a single course, yet he was lecturing me about patience. I told him this was no longer my problem. If Roger couldn't pay, then he'd have to face the legal consequences. It didn't take long for Roger's shady financial dealings to come to light. The police discovered he had multiple credit cards in default and a series of unpaid loans. He'd been shifting money between accounts for years, living on borrowed funds while pretending to have a stable consulting job. It was only a matter of time before everything caught up with him. When the day came for him to be formally charged, he tried to strike a plea deal, but the evidence was too substantial. My mother sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, face drawn and eyes filled with tears. She still wouldn't look at me. She blamed me for reporting him, for forcing the issue, for not being understanding of his financial woes. I felt no sympathy. Roger had stolen from me and shown no remorse. Jacob had insulted me and contributed nothing but whining. My mother had chosen their side. As far as I was concerned, they could live with the consequences of their actions. Roger was found guilty of fraud and theft, among other charges. He received a probation sentence and was ordered to repay not just me, but also several creditors. He couldn't keep up, and eventually he declared bankruptcy. Jacob dropped out of school once again, claiming the stress was too much. My mother called me, begging for help. She said they were going to lose the house, that they had nowhere else to go, and that I was punishing them for a mistake. But I didn't see it as a mere mistake. It was a deliberate act of betrayal, and neither Roger nor Jacob ever showed genuine remorse. I told my mother that I was done. I had my own life to build, and I refused to sink any more of my resources or emotional energy into their problems. I had already lost a significant chunk of my savings, spent countless hours dealing with legal issues, and endured emotional turmoil for months. I had nothing left to give them. She begged, she cried, and she guilt-tripped me, saying I was abandoning my family. I told her that family doesn't steal from each other and then expect the victim to be okay with it. She said I was being cruel, and I responded that I was merely protecting myself. I moved out of the house shortly after, renting a small apartment closer to my job. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. A few months after I settled into my new place, I heard that Roger and Jacob had packed up and left the house. My mother tried to hold on to it, but with all the debt and her meager income, she finally sold it at a loss. She texted me saying she missed me and wanted to talk. I agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe. She looked older, worn down by stress, and I almost felt sorry for her. But then she tried to convince me to drop what remained of the debt Roger owed to give him a fresh start. I realized she still believed I should sacrifice myself for their benefit. I told her no. I refused to let the past repeat. She stared at me, tears in her eyes, accusing me of being heartless. I responded that I'd simply learned to value my own dignity. We parted on tense terms, and she hasn't contacted me since. I've moved on with my life, found a better job, and started saving again. I refuse to forgive people who don't respect me enough to see me as more than a convenient resource.